Hey guys, welcome back to Stories from the Stead with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop, and head alchemist at Birdseye, Indiana's own Old Homestead Distillery. As always, from our hearts and hearths to yours. Today we're going to take a look at another one of the three famous preacher distillers from Washington County, Indiana. We've already spoken of Mr. Thomas Green. We will at some point speak of Mr. William Williams, who was located out at Old Mill Hollow. Some of you may be familiar with another name for that location in the form of Henderson Park outside of Salem, Indiana, the old water source for Salem, Indiana, and most of Washington County, really. But today we're going to focus on Benjamin Radcliff of Hardinsburg, Indiana, once again. So Benjamin Radcliff was born in Girard County, Kentucky, October 8th of 1790, to a distilling father. By 1850, he too had entered the same business as his father, having paid the 7th tax district of Kentucky $17.67 on 73 gallons of spirits he had produced that season. This same year, a receipt also exists for his purchase of a 16-year-old female slave girl. Sometime around 1819, after the death of his father, Benjamin and family moved to Washington County, Indiana, near Hardinsburg. His father left Benjamin, as well as his brother, his distilling estate, including multiple stills and fermentation tubs, as well as all of his slaves. Oral legend says that Radcliff actually released these slaves to freedom and offered them work, and that, in fact, they may have followed him and his family into Hardinsburg and have been a part of the local community there, much like Cheney Lively from the previous Alexander Ralston story. This was actually fairly common, much more common than what you might think. Oftentimes, these people, both black and white, slave owner and slave, knew one another, and that doesn't make it right in any way, shape, or form. That is not what I'm saying, but they were familiar with one another. Oftentimes, friendships and relationships actually blossomed out of that, specifically if the person was not a believer in slavery to begin with, and there's nothing to necessarily suggest that Benjamin Radcliff was a believer in slavery. His father's ownership of slaves doesn't mean that was something that he agreed with. His moving to southern Indiana actually might indicate that he was not a believer in slavery, and the move may have in fact have been partially to allow those slaves to have freedom and to have a chance at a new life, especially considering he settled in an area not too far away from a fairly large African American settlement, which is pretty interesting. Radcliff purchased a piece of property right on the Crawford County line and immediately erected a mill and a distillery on the large springs located there. This spring is actually now known as Radcliff Springs, and it's actually the third largest spring that we know of within the state of Indiana. Unfortunately, still kind of on private property and not easy to access. I'm not even sure who actually owns it at this point, but I have been to it before. It's an immense flow of limestone water. At one point in time, I actually knew the gallons per minute, but at this point, I couldn't even begin to tell you. The family was actually received on a recommendation letter into the Unity Baptist Church once they moved into Indiana. The church having no regular meeting house, instead meeting at the homes of congregants. Again, this was very common in the early days of Indiana. There really were not a lot of churches. The Blue River Association, which was obviously started at Old Blue River Church, was really sort of the main charter house for a lot of the churches, and not just for the Christians, but for the Primitive Baptists, the Regular Baptists, the Methodists, etc. They all sort of worked through that same organization, and oftentimes they worked alongside one another. There wasn't nearly as much headbutting as what there might be between churches nowadays back in those days. Of course, when your primary concern is making sure that you're not killed by bear, panther, or rattlesnake, or attacked by the local natives, you tend to overlook some things that maybe in a more modern society you wouldn't overlook. That being said, let's move forward with my story and see if I can read the rest of my notes here. So oral legend actually states that the southeast unmarked corner of the old churchyard where Radcliff and family were buried consists of many of the freed slaves Radcliff brought from Kentucky. Interestingly, no records exist of Radcliff's mill as a commercial venture, leading one to believe it was likely for the exclusive use of the distillery only. Now, I have heard this oral legend from many of the families that are actually buried out at Old Unity, many of the descendants of those families that are buried out at Old Unity, and I have dowsed that area. I am big on dowsing rods and finding old unmarked graves. I can tell you that there are a lot of graves in that area, and they are not marked, and they're not only not marked. If they were marked with stones, they would have been primitive field stones. You see the same sort of thing at Beck's Mill Cemetery on the backside of the cemetery. Some of that is because people died of various diseases. You had to get them in the ground. If they were travelers, you might not know their names. But a lot of times, too, with freed African Americans or even potentially still enslaved African Americans, you will find the same kind of treatment. What a lot of people don't understand is that even though Indiana wasn't a slave state, it should also mention that there was a strange law in the books for a very long time that actually allowed you to take a slave into a non-slave holding territory, hold that slave for right at 6 months, and as long as you took that slave back into a territory that allowed slavery and then brought them back into the other territory, you could hold them for another 6 months. Unfortunately, this was a very common thing in southern Indiana. Now, I'm not saying that's what Radcliff was doing. I'm just saying that that is a thing that did happen quite often here. It really is a correlation to the gravestones more than anything else. But in 1830, Benjamin donated the land for the church and cemetery to the organization. And in October of 1833, the church granted Radcliff ordination as well as the right to work as an itinerant preacher at other local associated houses whenever their preacher was not available or they didn't have one on staff. Ordaining him as part of the primitive Predestinarian organization, and we're going to get to that word in a minute because it's interesting as well. From 1841 to 1849, when he finally passed away, Benjamin was actually the full-time pastorate. The distillery, we know, continued until at least 1835. It may have continued after that. We don't know for sure, but the last mention of it that we have is around 1835. And an article was written in Pioneer Pickings in the Salem Democrat by Mr. Horace Efron. So for those of you who don't know Washington County history, you probably don't know the name Horace Efron, but I promise you, you keep watching Stories from the Stead, you will know that name. Horace Efron was in many ways an awful human being. He was part of what was called the Sons of Liberty, or the Knights of the Golden Circle, what would eventually morph into the KKK. He was a quote-unquote peace Democrat, Southern sympathizer, Copperhead, etc. He only really did two great things in his life that he should get credit for. The first is writing this series of articles in the Salem Democrat and newspaper before that, which may be the Independent, the name escapes me at the moment, where he would talk to the surviving early pioneers of Washington County, Indiana, and get their stories or talk to their children, etc. And he called that article Pioneer Pickings. Later, the vast majority of those articles, I think starting with issue 19 or something like that, were collated into a book called Pioneer Pickings that is full of deep history from Washington County that is otherwise impossible to find anywhere else. The only other thing that Horace Efron probably did that was worth mentioning is that it does seem that he is the gentleman who actually surrendered the town of Salem to Morgan before General John Hunt Morgan could open up the cannons that were set atop the hill pointing at the courthouse. He is the gentleman who raised the white flag, having had some association with some of Morgan's men who also didn't like him because they didn't like how cowardly he seemed to be in the whole situation. But Efron goes on to tell us that Radcliff had no opposition to the title of preacher and distiller, as he was well known on Sundays to throw open the doors and the windows of the Unity Church such that he could hear the millstones running at the mill to know that his distillery was operating. This was noted because he did it in all weather. It didn't matter if it was snowing and below zero, the doors and windows of Old Unity Church were open so that he could hear those millstones and know that his boys were down at the distillery doing their job. So the church itself actually sat directly on the hill right above the old distillery. And if anyone is familiar with Hardinsburg, they're familiar with Radcliff Road. Radcliff Road used to actually go directly to that old mill, and then that road would come across across the river and come up exactly to where Old Unity Church was, where Old Unity Cemetery is now. Now, I said a term earlier, Predestinarian, I can't remember. Anyways, it doesn't matter. And you might also notice that I switched from talking about Unity Church to Old Unity Church. And there is a reason for that. There was a split in this church. So you had Primitive Baptist, and then you had Predestinarian Baptists. Predestinarian Baptists started on the East Coast. They were very, very conservative in their belief system. And it led to this idea, maybe some of you are familiar with this, but I bet a vast many of you are not, of what is called a two-seed church. So a two-seed church basically believes that you are either born a seed of God from day one, or a seed of the devil. And there is nothing you can do to change your circumstances. Nothing you can do will get you into heaven if you are not a seed of God. And so the best possible thing that you can do on this earth, if you are not a seed of God, is to help the church, even though you really can't be a member of the church, and associate yourself with the church in order to help those who are predestined to go to heaven. But otherwise, live your life, because this is the only chance you're going to get to enjoy any of the happiness that comes along with being a spiritual being. Now, this split in the church at Unity didn't happen until after the death of Benjamin Radcliff, and I don't know how much that predestinarian thing was already rambling around within that church during Radcliffe's lifetime. But I do know that that particular church split in two, and when that church split in two, it actually led to almost a firefight. The Predestinarians took up shelter in the Old Unity Church. Legend has it that they nailed the windows down and took up arms in the church, and they were willing to fight their brethren within the church to make sure that church became a Predestinarian church, that it would not be anything otherwise than that. And so therefore you have Old Unity, which building no longer exists, and then in Hardinsburg to this day you have Unity Church, which is I believe a Baptist church still to this day. But that is the difference between the two of them. They are not the same church, although they split off of the same organization. There were actually quite a number of these churches in Indiana at one point in time, and my understanding is there still is one of these churches in the state of Indiana, and several in Texas, as I understand as well. So those Texas roots may even touch on Indiana as well, because a lot of the second sons of the early settlers of southern Indiana went to Texas to fight for Texas independence and ended up staying there, including some of the descendants of Mr. George Beck. So I will actually be out at Beck's Mill tomorrow talking some Washington County and greater Black Forest, as well as Switzerland County, Indiana distilling history, and I hope to see some of you guys there. I hope you are enjoying the stories from the Stead. Benjamin Radcliff is certainly an interesting person. I wish we knew a little bit more about him and could share a little bit more with you about him, and if we ever find any more, we certainly will. As always, from our hearts and hearts to yours, love y'all.